Welcome to News in Depth, where we delve deeper into the biggest stories of the day. I'm Kim Mo-gen. Now, 4 years have passed since South Korea and North Korea signed an agreement to reduce military tension on the peninsula. But fast forward to now, tensions have once again risen, with the North Korean leader flatly rejecting any form of talks, especially on denuclearization. And so all eyes are now on what related message will be delivered by President Yoon Suk-yeol at the UN General Assembly just a matter of hours from now. For an analysis of the current situation and insights on how the Yoon administration should go about its inter-Korean policies, we invite Michiel, Hoogeveen, a Dutch member of the European Parliament, here in the studio with us. Welcome to the show, Mr. Hoogeveen.
Thank you for having me.
So first, we know that you're based in the Netherlands and that you started your career as a freelance North Korea researcher. Can I ask why and what prompted you to gain interest in North Korean affairs?
Well, I started as a political scientist, and I specialized in the Northeast Asia region with a particular interest in the Korean Peninsula, because this is one of the few places on Earth where the Cold War from the last century is still very much alive. And I was specialized on the economic policies of North Korea, looking at how they perceive investments, how they perceive economic cooperation with South Korea, especially under the Sunshine Policy. So that's how I got here, and now I'm an elected member of European Parliament and a member of the Korea delegation for relations with the European Union.
Right. So now more deeper into the current affairs stories. Lately, North Korea passed a law that allows, it allows it to authorize the use of its nuclear weapons programs preemptively. And leader Kim Jong-un also said that there will be no denuclearization and no negotiation on that front. How did you read into the latest message from the North?
Well, I don't think much has changed. I think this is what North Korea has continued to be doing for the last decades, saber rattling. They've continued to be testing nuclear weapons, ICBMs, SLBMs, and the nuclear weapons were already enshrined into the law of North Korea, but they just expanded upon it. It's just a way of having them being perceived as this irrational actor in the Northeast Asia region and a threat to regional and global security, while in fact they aren't irrational. They are very calculative, and this was a very calculated maneuver by Kim Jong-un.
So then what kind of precise action from South Korea or the U.S. Prompted such kind of hardline approach from North Korea?
Well, I think that after the failed Hanoi summit in 2019, the election of Joe Biden as President of the United States and his consequent policies, and the election of President Yoon has made the North Koreans realize that as soon as you start negotiations with the West, with South Korea, with the United States, that denuclearization, the conclusion, according to them, of the negotiations is the starting point. And they don't want to start with talking about denuclearization. They want to talk about a whole other range of subjects. So in that respect, they have tried to make it very clear, we don't want to negotiate on denuclearization, even if you put sanctions on us.
Mm-hmm. We'll go back to the sanctions front as we speak. But before that, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol revealed South Korea's audacious initiative on North Korea, and the regime kind of rejected the proposal. But do you think there still be room for negotiation on that front, and especially with the remainder of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration?
I'm not here to tell what the South Korean government should or shouldn't do. What I can say is that from the North Korean perspective, when I spoke with North Koreans when I was there in the country, and it reminded me of what was the plan of President Lee, the promised 3,000 plan. Which was basically the same as the audacious plan by President Yoon, is that the North Koreans perceive it as a bribe. So they see it as, okay, we should give up our nuclear weapons and you will parachute in all kinds of investments, McDonald's and all kinds of Western imperialist companies, which they're not very interested in. So from their perspective, it's seen as giving up their ultimate fail-safe, their ticket to regime survival in exchange for money. According to them, it's a bribe, so I don't think they will take the bite.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to what we mentioned a while ago about the sanctions, in an opinion piece a few years ago, you said that international efforts through sanctions have failed to denuclearize North Korea. And in fact, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has recently said that even if the regime faces 100 years of sanctions, it will not surrender its nuclear weapons. So can you explain to us, why do you think sanctions don't work on North Korea?
Well, the opinion piece was written some years ago, but I'm regretful to say that I was proven right in this regard. If we look at decades of sanctions, North Korea is one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. They've continued to do nuclear testing, ICBM testing, SLBM testing. So apparently something went wrong here. Well, first of all, the sanctions have emboldened the regime. So they can tell now to their own population, you're not impoverished because of the rotten political and economic system we're having, but you are impoverished because of the Western imperialist sanctions. And secondly, there's also, of course, China, who sees North Korea as a geopolitical asset. And they will more or less abide to the UN sanctions, but they are always quite lenient on North Korea, and they will continue to keep the regime afloat. So I think in that sense, sanctions will not make sense.
Mm-hmm. Then what kind of diplomatic action would you suggest to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula?
Paradoxically, if you want to get rid of the nukes, you should stop talking about the nukes. And I think that President Moon Jae-in saw that, he recognized that. I mean, you should obviously state that denuclearization is a long-term goal for both Koreas. But in the meantime, you have to ask yourself the underlying question: why does North Korea has nuclear weapons? And that is because they see themselves being under threat. Obviously, you have South Korea at their southern border, a very successful country, part of the global economy, after the Cold War, recognized by the Russian Federation, by the People's Republic of China. And you have North Korea, who is an impoverished state, a failed industrial economy, not yet recognized by the state of Japan, not recognized by the United States. So they feel under threat. So you need to do confidence-building measures, talk about trade, talk about investment, but also talk about setting up a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Mm-hmm. And then later on, it can take decades, according to the North Koreans, maybe generations, you can talk about denuclearization.
So it'll take quite some time.
Yes.
But now, so in a few hours from now, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol is set to deliver a speech at the UN General Assembly in New York. And with the latest developments between the two Koreas, well, it's too early to predict, but what kind of message can we expect from the leader? And what kind of message do you think would be helpful, in improving ties?
I think that President Yoon was on the right track last week when he met Chairman Lee from the Chinese Communist Party, where he said that, well, because also of the war in Ukraine, we are now moving towards a very geopolitical tense period. But we should always recognize that there are still mutual gains and interdependencies in the world, whether it be in supply chain, in economic growth, in jobs, in transportation. So I hope that his message will be focused on that aspect. And also, as I said before, in terms of the Koreas, not just only talk about denuclearization. Obviously, it's a long-term project, but you need to talk about improving the lives of the people in North Korea as well.
Right. So speaking of the lives of the people in North Korea, lately you tweeted about the necessity of providing medical aid to the regime as the people are kind of suffering from COVID-19. Well, North Korea still insists that it's COVID-free, though. But since you visited the regime several times, how do you suppose the pandemic situation looked like over there?
When I was there in 2014, there was this global Ebola outbreak, if you can remember. I was there in the country when they closed down their borders, although Ebola was not even remotely near North Korea. And they already set up all kinds of test centers and quarantine policies for foreigners. And I found out that the North Koreans are extremely scared of an outbreak of a certain virus. Obviously, their healthcare system is in a detrimental state. So when an outbreak occurs in the country, panic could also occur. And a panic could spark maybe even a revolution. So the North Koreans are very, very calculative when it comes to containing the virus. I think they've been quite successful in the beginning of the COVID pandemic when they closed their borders. But I think the virus is there now. They have what they call by themselves people with feverish symptoms, so probably COVID. I think Kim Jong-un is relatively lucky that the Omicron variant, which is probably in his country, is more mild than previous variants. Nevertheless, vaccines save lives. They prevent the spread of COVID. So as delegation in the European Parliament, we offered vaccines to the North Koreans in order to have them start the vaccination campaign.
So do you think North Korea would be willing to accept it?
Well, they haven't responded yet. However, Chairman Kim has stated in his latest speech, he cited the World Health Organization, where he said that during the winter there will probably be a new outbreak, and he wanted to start a vaccination campaign. So yeah, we don't have any response yet, but we might have a response in the future, and we're always willing to help if it helps the North Korean people.
But considering the system and how it goes in North Korea, do you think it's feasible for the entire North Korean population to be inoculated with a vaccine, like Chairman Kim mentioned?
Probably that will be difficult. Probably his focus will lie on its showcase capital, Pyongyang. In the end, I think as an international community, we should also continue to offer to help the North Korean people in distributing vaccines and in order to inoculate the entire population.
And also lately, South Korea celebrated the Chuseok holidays, Thanksgiving holidays. And before that, the South Korean government officially made a request to the North to have talks on resuming the unifications of the separated families between the two countries. But North Korea has yet to respond on it. What do you think about the prospects of the possibilities for North to accept that kind of request from the South Korean government?
Well, I think this is the right direction to take. Instead of constantly emphasizing denuclearization when reaching out to North Korea, I do believe that the reunions of separated families is something that can be of tremendous value both to the North Korean people and the South Korean people, and that's some little gradual things that we can make sure that North Korea starts opening up a bit again. Talking about family reunions, talking about maybe the resumption of the Kaesong industrial complex, which employed 50,000 North Korean workers at some point. Talking about the Mount Kumgang tourist zone, which attracted 1 million South Korean tourists I think since 2008. So I think these kinds of projects that started under the late President Kim Dae-jung should be reopened again, or at least attempted to be reopened, because these are of tremendous value in trying to open up North Korea at least a little bit.
Right, and we're hearing some kind of news that the Kaesong industrial complex is operated slowly by themselves. So for North Korea, what would be good for them? What would they benefit from in saying yes to these kinds of joint projects with South Korea?
I think that the Kaesong industrial complex has had a tragic end to a quite successful project. Whereas more than 100 of South Korean companies were able to employ more than 50,000 North Korean workers who had relatively good labor conditions, one of the best jobs that we're able to get for North Koreans. They're now operating it themselves because the Kaesong industrial complex was closed down. I think talks on reopening the Kaesong industrial complex could initiate some little bit of opening up of the North Korean economy as well, which could benefit both the South Korean companies. I think latest research showed that South Korea could definitely benefit from a reopening of the Kaesong industrial complex, but it also would be better for the North Korean workers.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much for making time for us, Mr. Hoogeveen. We appreciate your insights.
It was my pleasure.
And that will be all for News in Depth tonight. Have a great rest of the evening. We'll be back next time with more in-depth stories on issues happening across the globe now.